right, so what is disease X, right? We're hearing that term a lot, disease X, the new pandemic, the new pathogen that's coming to wipe us all out. So what is it? What is disease X? So on paper, right, we're not going to start with anything nefarious. Disease X is a term used by the World Health Organization, dates back potentially to 2018 as a placeholder, right? It's just saying, hey, brand X, disease X, some point in the future, someday, some point at some time, there'll be another pandemic, there'll be another pathogen. There's quite a few out there to pick from, and that will spread across the world, have lethal consequences. So rather than naming one, Ebola, Marburg, smallpox, bird flu, pick from the list and say that's coming, they just say something's coming, right? And the statistics, the numbers behind that certainly support that something is, right? And we'll jump into that. I don't want to try to spill it all out right away, but no, we'll jump into what are pandemics, how frequent they come in, what to expect, weaponization. I'm going to try to hit it all here as I'm sitting in the car. So disease X, assuming nothing nefarious, is simply a placeholder. They don't know what's next, right? Now, there are a lot of speculations on nefarious intent, that they're preparing for another pandemic, something weaponized, and it's not simply a placeholder, right? And I can't say either way. I'm not speculating on that. My intent here is to provide information, education. We're all very familiar with the term pandemic at this point. I did want to spell it out a little bit. So pandemic is simply a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease over a whole country or the world at a particular time. The reason I'm saying that is it does not depend on lethality, right? And there's a lot of talk. Was the last pandemic a real pandemic? Was it not a real pandemic? The fact that a virus spread, regardless of whether it was natural or man-made, or the lethality was high or low, isn't necessary to use the term pandemic, right? So we're just saying there was a pandemic. Pandemics occur when something is spreading, something bad, some pathogen is spreading around the world, right? Not that it was lethal or not lethal, real or not real, or any of that stuff. Simply the term pandemic itself is rather benign, right? So if you look historically, there have been 249 recorded pandemics since 1200 BC, so not uncommon, right? And they are becoming more frequent. So the information I'm looking at is the world we live in. Pandemics are becoming more frequent. In the last 4 major pandemics occurred about 15 years apart on average, and you could speculate as to why they're becoming more frequent. Some of it could be weaponization, but it could also be the world's getting smaller, right? We travel quite a bit. Someone can get sick in Hong Kong. You've all seen the movie. And they get on a plane, and then it spreads around the world, right? Wherever it is, not picking on Hong Kong or Bangkok or anywhere else you want to be, the world's getting smaller, right? People travel everywhere all the time. Therefore, the chances of something spreading get much higher, right? The world's smaller, things can spread. So I want to look at what was the deadliest pandemic of all time, and that was the Black Death, bubonic plague. Killed about 75 million people between 1346 and 1353, and that had about a 60% kill rate. So 60% of the European population perished under the bubonic plague. So that is the deadliest pandemic that we have on record. The second most lethal was the 1918 bird flu, or 1918 flu, which was 50 million. 50 million people perished on that. So those are big numbers. Those are big pandemics, but the worst one was at a 60%. So we haven't seen a true spread of something that would have, say, a 90%, right, 90% kill rate. And just incidentally, and I know I've made videos on this before, I've talked about this before, the idea of a grid down situation, long-term grid down, whether it's EMP or whatever. There's a speculation, that if it's lasted more than a year, we'd see a 90% reduction in population. So this is a reoccurring theme, and to me that makes me sad, not just because of the loss of life, because so much of the population, as the world is now, could not survive without electricity, right? more lethal than even the most lethal pandemic that's ever struck the earth is turning off the power. So that in itself is a little sad, but that's off the point, right? I'm going down a rabbit hole there. So most lethal pathogens, actually, I had to look this up. I was a little surprised. Rabies. Rabies is listed as the most lethal pathogen out there. The thing is, once it becomes symptomatic, so it's 99% lethal. So if you get rabies and it's untreated, is the thing, it becomes 99% lethal. And about 59,000 people die every year of rabies, very few in the United States, which is why if you get bit by a dog or an animal and there's a chance that it could be rabies, they just start treating you right away. They can't wait for symptoms, because once you have the symptoms, you're pretty much going to perish. So listed, if you look around, listed as high consequence pathogens, number one you've got out there is Ebola, which is in the same family of things like Marburg or Raven virus. I did a video about Marburg and Raven virus. Raven doesn't get a lot of attention. Things like smallpox, anthrax, those are the high consequence ones. I'm adding potential pathogens, which is bird flu. Bird flu is naturally occurring, easily transmissible around the world in terms that it spreads by birds, it's spreading to other animals. It's not easily transmissible between animals and people, which is the zoonotic, right? It is spreading, it is mutating, it's spreading constantly, and it is certainly a high watch, and that's one of those 90%ers, right? If bird flu got to the point that it's spreading from person to person, that would be bad, right? That would be something out of an apocalypse movie. That would be an end of civilization event. So what about weaponization, right? We always hear about weaponization. We hear about gain of function, right? Are there evil scientists around the world, or perhaps just curious scientists around the world making these things more lethal? And the answer is yes, right? And actually the history of weaponization of pathogens goes back to 1500 BC. So there were tularemia, which is rabbit fever outbreak. So there was a group that drove victims of rabbit fever onto enemy lands, causing an endemic. So at the time, 1500 BC, 1200 BC approximation there, one group was actually driving infected people towards enemy lands and created a pandemic. So weaponization of pathogen goes way back, right? That is not a new idea, and you've heard about things like smallpox blankets in American history, where they took blankets from victims that died or had smallpox, and then they sort of bundle them up and give them to people they don't like. So that is part of our history. So weaponization, using pathogens as weapons, is not new, right? That's not new at all. And you hear about things like gain of function research. We hear about that recently, and I'm going to say allegedly, right? Allegedly, there's some Chinese coronavirus research where they took something in a lab and they're testing it out, and it's something like 90%, 99%, 100% lethal against mice, humanized rodents, whatever you want to say. So certainly gain of function research to make viruses more lethal happens, right? If you want to assume non-nefarious intent, you could speculate that they do that. So now they have a super version of the virus, of the pathogen, and they can use that to develop vaccines, right? If you want to assume non-nefarious intent. However, we know weaponization is a thing, so there's certainly the other side is building a better weapon, right? I can't speculate as to what happened in China, what their intent was, who was involved. I'm not speculating any of that. We know both, right? They do the scientific research under the idea that they're going to make a vaccine for something that's lethal. We also know that there are bad actors that will weaponize pathogens, right? So historically, anthrax, botulism, foot and mouth disease, glanders plague, Q fever, rice blast, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, smallpox, tularemia, all others have all been attempted to weaponize, whether it's anthrax, smallpox, bird flu, right? You name it, right? Someone's probably tried to weaponize it and maybe been successful, right? So there are also potential accidents, right? And why? I think I skipped over. Why does it matter? Why does it matter if a virus was created naturally or if it's weaponized, if it was gain of function? Is frequency, right? If we're saying happens on average every 15 years, you could say since the last pandemic, we probably have another 15 years. Well, if there's weaponized pandemics, if there's weaponized pathogens, if they're released, all bets are off. Is it next year? Is it 10 years? Is it 100 years? They could occur at any time, unfortunately, and that's just the world we live in and have lived in for some time, right? There's also the potential for accidents. You could have only good intentions, but things can still be released, right? So whether it's nefarious, whether it's accidental, whether it's naturally occurring, pandemics do happen. So perhaps that is some of the idea behind Disease X, which is something's going to happen, and we know it's going to happen. Statistically, it happens, can happen through nefarious means, so we should start preparing, right? Just throwing that out there. I'm not defending the WHO. I'm not saying they're good people at all. Something I'm seeing recently, which is potential accidents. I guess there's a group in Colorado. From what I've read, I have, only anecdotal evidence, is they're doing an Ebola vaccine and it's shedding, right? They're saying 32% shed rate. So what's that mean if a vaccine is shedding? Sounds bad. So if you're using a live attenuated vaccine, which means the subject is being injected with a reduced version but still live version of a virus that has to replicate in the body to build that immune response, but it's a live version of the virus, and there is some chance that because you have a live version of the virus, in this case Ebola, it sheds and could spread to other people. Now that is uncommon, however, not unheard of. I did some research on it. There was an oral polio vaccine, which is no longer used in the United States, that when it was shedding, it actually had the chance to infect people with polio, versus what is supposed to happen, which is, hey, it may shed, which means you are infectious because you got the vaccine. Even if you infected someone else, because it's attenuated, because it's a minimized version, it's a reduced version of the virus, they won't actually get sick. So I can't say, and I don't know how much information's out there on the Ebola vaccine going on in Colorado, whether that shedding would result in secondary infections. I don't know, right? How would I know? I'm not trying to build conspiracies or theories. Statistically, historically, it is possible, right? It happened with the oral polio vaccine. Sometimes it doesn't work out the way they thought it would. So what do you do, right? What do you do about Disease X, right? What do you do about a major pandemic? The next one is statistically it's every 15 years. If we want to call 2020, you're telling me between now and 2035, odds are there will be another one. Maybe sooner if it's weaponized, right? Maybe longer. We hope it's longer. We hope it never happens. Hope it's 100 years from now. But statistically, you probably got about 10, 12 years or sooner. Well, no one wants to hear it, but self-quarantine. Historically, self-quarantine. Separate yourself from the pathogen, right, is going to be the best. That is the only real option, is to avoid becoming infected. And I had a list of pathogens. I don't think I read it off. So when I say pathogen, we're not just talking about viruses. There's bacteria, there's funguses, there's parasites. The Last of Us was a fungus, I think, which was great. Great show. I like The Last of Us. But what do you do, right? How do you survive the next pandemic? And as I said, it's isolation, it's quarantine. That's been the gold standard throughout history. And in order to do that, you have to be prepared ahead of time. I'm not talking about paper masks or anything like that. It's, do you have food? Do you have water? Do you have supplies? Do you live in a place where you can cut yourself off from the world in the event something like that happens? And you'll know, we'll know, assuming you're not in the first group to get sick, if there was a pathogen in a pandemic, meaning spreading around the world, that was infecting people and had an 80-90% lethality rate, you would know, we would all know pretty quickly. We're talking 90%, so if it goes into a city with 1 million people, 900,000 people would perish, right? Bodies would be stacked. Now, once again, that's never happened. The last one was more like, I think I said at 50-60% the bubonic plague, but still you're talking about bodies stacking at that point. Whether it would be reported or hidden or anything like that, I don't know, but I suspect we would know. As a people, we would know that, hey, this is a bad one. Number one, and it said, number one, and maybe your only option is quarantine, is lock yourself down. I know we don't like lockdowns, and there's certainly the potential for lockdowns to be used in a nefarious way, but something like that, disease X, some 90% lethal pathogen, 80, what would it take, 50%, you flip a coin, you perish. Once again, are you ready to quarantine? Are you ready to lock down? So I'm not talking about wearing paper masks when you're driving by yourself in the car. I'm talking about legit bodies dropping in the streets. Do you have the food? Do you have water? Do you have the ability to defend your food and water, medical supplies, those kind of things? It's what you would want to think about, right, as a prepper. It's what you would always have as a prepper in the event, if and when, right? We can say when, because regardless of weaponization, of gain of function, pandemics historically happen, right? It's something that happens throughout history and could and will happen again. Is you have to be prepared ahead of time, right? It's not going to be a situation where you go to the store and you just get the stuff you need. And I've talked to preppers, right? And I've talked to serious preppers, and their plan is, hey, if something happens, I'm going to run to the store, I'm going to get the stuff I need, and we're going to be great, which is no, that's not prepared. You may call that a plan on paper because you certainly have a plan, but if you're not prepared to lock down now, to quarantine now, then you're not prepared, right? Good that you have a plan, but if your plan is looting, if your plan is I'm going to go to my neighbor's, I'm going to find the nearest prepper and steal his stuff, probably not a good plan, right? It's about, are you prepared now? Do you have the food you need? Do you have the water you need? Do you have the supplies you need? Do you have the tools to defend your supplies and the ability to lock down? And given enough time, do you have the ability to replenish those supplies, whether you're gathering water, growing food, those kind of things, right? There's a lot to it. But I want to jump into that, right? I'm seeing a lot of stuff on Disease X, and I'm seeing a lot of hype and concern, right, about pathogens, about gain of function, and all I can say is yes, right? That has happened throughout history. None of this is new, right? As I said, 1500 BC, they weaponized pathogens, and that was a lot of years ago. So throughout human history, it happens. Throughout human history, pandemics spread naturally. It's a part of things. So it's probably not a bad idea, especially when we're living in a world where pandemics happen every 15 years, to at least think about what you would do to prepare. What would you do to survive? I know we all have a little pandemic fatigue, and certainly a great deal of skepticism when we hear about the word pandemics, and that's understandable. But be aware. Be aware is the types of pathogens you wouldn't be wanted to be infected with are out there. Weaponization does happen, right? When you're talking about 90% lethality, Marburg, Ebola, Raven virus, rabies. I've read about weaponized rabies, all that kind of stuff that's out there. So not building fear. Certainly we want to live a normal life, prosperous and happy, but as a prepper or as an individual that's interested, not a bad time to at least think about what you would do, how you would prepare for that, because once it happens, it's too late. So, as always, thank you for watching, and we appreciate you.